QuickBooks recently added a new feature that allows you to create a backdated bill or invoice directly from the Bank Transactions tab as you're doing data entry. And to be honest, this is kind of a brilliant move. But before we dive in and start using it for everything, I do want to show you a few different things. There are some areas where this feature really shines. If you're fixing a one-off transaction that you've missed, it makes life a heck of a lot easier. But there are some missing components here. For example, you can't add the same level of detail that you usually do. And on top of that, if you accidentally match the incorrect transaction to this backdated bill or invoice that you've created, you're actually going to create extra cleanup work for yourself in order to fix it. So let me walk you through the whole process, where it's applicable, how to use it, where it's really shining, and where it can create that extra work for you. Let's go ahead and get started. So to find this, we're going to go right into our Bank Transactions tab, okay? So that's going to be, if you have it bookmarked, fabulous. Otherwise, you can click on Accounting right here, and it will be the first option that comes up. So I have one bill and one invoice transaction to walk through here with you guys. So in this particular instance, the way that we create a backdated bill or invoice to go along with the transaction is by clicking this little caret all the way to the very right-hand side of our screen next to Post. And then it comes up with a list of options. Well, like I said, create backdated bill, or in the case of incoming money, create backdated invoice is a new feature that has recently been rolled out. So let's look at what this actually looks like and where I might actually want to use this feature. So let's say, for example, that I got a bill from Nope Social Media for $600, and this bill came in back on March 30th or 31st. And I never entered the bill. I just went ahead and paid it online and forgot to get that entered, okay? Well, if I'm on cash basis, this really kind of doesn't matter from an accounting standpoint, right? I could go ahead and classify this as advertising and marketing and move on with my life, no problem. However, if I'm on accrual basis, I really do want to have that bill in there so that I am recognizing the expenses at the time they were incurred and when they were truly incurred, which in this case would have been several days earlier than I paid it, okay? So I can actually say create a backdated bill right here, and this is the screen that pops up. Okay, now, like I said, you're not going to see quite the same level of detail that you would see if you were going through the process of entering a bill right from the plus create button, right? We're not going to be able to use the feed feature for this. We're not going to be able to add attachments here in this screen. And we're also not going to be able to add a description or a memo of any kind, right? We are just getting the bare bones instance of what's going on. So first of all, we would want to select the date for the backdated bill. In this case, like I said, it was March 30th or 31st, so I'll just put in the 31st here. And then we want to select our category. Now, this is going to be the same as when we're entering a bill. And since this is for Nope Social Media, I know this is for advertising, right? And then finally, we want to select the vendor. So that's going to be for Nope Social Media. All right. Now, here is what is going to happen when I click Create and Post, okay? Not only is QuickBooks going to create a bill that will be filled out with Nope Social Media and the expense category will be advertising, it's automatically going to pull the dollar amount that was paid from the bank feed, which we know is that $600. And then it is automatically going to create the bill payment as well. So, you know, in the usual accounts payable, accounts receivable process, we have the whole multi-step process where we're creating an invoice or a bill, and then we're marking that as paid, and then we're matching it in our bank feed, right? That's the whole process. This takes it down to one single step. Okay, so instead of creating a bill, marking it as paid, and then matching it when it comes through our bank feed, we're doing all of that directly from our Bank Transactions tab. And like I said, that is honestly pretty cool. So we'll go ahead and click Create and Post. And once I do that, this is going to be removed from my Bank Transactions tab, okay? That's phenomenal. That means that I have done that whole accounts payable process in one single step. But let's go ahead and look at some of the detractions and what can kind of go wrong in this situation. So first things first, let's go ahead and go to my vendor center here. And let's look at what this invoice actually looks like from Nope Social Media. So if I click in here, we can see I have a bill for Nope Social Media for advertising. All right, let's click on it and see. We don't have any kind of description in here. We don't have a bill number. We don't show, it automatically assumes that the terms were due on receipt. That may or may not be the case for the vendor, okay? And then on top of that, we don't have any kind of attachment here. So we have created a transaction, yes, and it's going to show up on our reports and it's going to be reported the correct way, again, especially on accrual basis. But we are definitely missing some data that we might want to have as a matter of overall practice, okay? While it may or may not be worth it for you to be attaching documentation to every single transaction, and while you may or may not need to have a bill number or description in there, those do tend to be best practices. And so we want to have documentation where it makes sense. Again, this is fantastic if this was one bill that I accidentally forgot to enter and I now want to kind of complete that process and make sure that everything was reported in the correct period. But if I'm doing that for every single bill, then I'm going to be missing some of that data, and it's going to end up being more work to go in and edit each of these bills to get all the information that I might want in there than it is to just walk through the process the correct way, as it were, to start, right? Where we enter the bill, provide all the documentation, and then match it up with the bank feed when it gets paid, okay? So that is the first kind of drawback here that we're seeing. The other thing here, and I want to go ahead and call your attention to this, is let's say, for example, that I had accidentally matched that transaction incorrectly. Let's say that that was either not for Nope Social Media, or it should have been matched to a different transaction that was already on my books, or it was a totally new transaction with no invoice associated with it, okay? Usually if something like that happens, we have a few different options. We can just edit the transaction in our bank register. If we just classify it, we can change the expense category. Or if we have matched it incorrectly, we can just recall that transaction and then match it to the corrected transaction. So let's go ahead and take a look at what happens if I go in and I recall that transaction. So in order to do that, I would go into my Bank Transactions tab and then select Posted. And then I would go find that transaction on 4/7 that was sent out to Nope Social Media right here. And I would click Undo, right? Usually that would pull that transaction back to our bank feed and then allow us to match it with the other transaction. Well, here's the thing. Since I have created a whole accounts payable flow by entering that backdated bill, I actually now have additional steps to get this particular transaction cleared off my books. So let's go ahead and take a look. I've pulled that transaction back to pending, right? We can see that it offers that up as a match still. So if I go into my bank register, what I will see, if I go down to 4/7, is that I still have that $600 transaction on the books, okay? More than that, if I go into my vendor center and go to Nope Social Media, I will find that both the bill and the bill payment are still on the books, okay? So that is kind of, again, a bit of a detraction, because if I entered that in error, I now have to go in and delete both of these transactions. Otherwise, they're just going to be sitting on my books and gumming up the works, right? So that is definitely something to keep in mind when you are going through this process. And this is true both of the Create a Backdated Bill feature and the Create a Backdated Invoice feature, which we're going to go ahead and walk through now as well. So if I go back here to Bank Transactions, I have this transaction right here, which was a payment received from a client of mine named Frank Lee, okay? Now, if I go in and say, again, next to post, there's this little caret right here, and I can say, create a backdated invoice. Awesome. Again, this definitely cuts down. You can see where we're completing the whole accounts payable or accounts receivable process in one single step and with only a few details. That's pretty nice. So I can click here and do that, and the same information is going to be requested, okay? So I have to say when the invoice should be dated, and again, since the payment was received in April, we'll say it was March 31st. We have to select a product or service to go with this. So in this case, I'm just going to call it monthly bookkeeping. And then we have to assign the customer, who will be Frank Lee. So what I can do here is I can click create and post. And again, that's going to do that whole process all in one step. But once again, if I go back into Frank Lee's customer profile, I'm going to see that that invoice lacks some detail. It's only going to have the date, the name, the income account, and the dollar amount. That's it. Okay. So if your accounts receivable process involves billing for transactions that you've already paid for, or using your timesheets to collect an amount of time and then bill it to a customer, you're going to not see those things line up in this particular instance. Okay. So again, it's a really fantastic feature and honestly can definitely cut down on data entry time, especially for little one-off transactions. I definitely would recommend weighing whether or not this is something that you would want to implement on an ongoing basis, or whether this is something you would only want to use for occasional one-off transactions. Okay. I will link the videos that I've done for both the accounts payable and accounts receivable process so that you can see what each individual step in those processes look like. But this really does package it all into one and makes it much more straightforward so that you can just move on with your reconciliation or whatever else it is you're trying to do with your data entry, okay? But just be aware of how this does impact your ability to look back on things and see what was actually billed for or what was actually charged to you. And also understand that if you do have to recall a transaction for any reason and do it over, you are also going to have to go in and remove the other transactions that are on the books. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Holly from Accrual Mistress Bookkeeping and Consulting. I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please do like and subscribe. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave those in the comments below. I'll be happy to help.